Coming soon, Fast and Furious in space. Family.
What is up, everybody? Random Man here, bringing you my review for Fast and Furious presents Hobbs and Shaw. Now, the plot of this action film basically follows our title leads, Luke Hobbs and Deckard Shaw, played by Dwayne Johnson and Jason Statham respectively, as the unlikely allies must team up against a greater threat that is threatening the world with a deadly virus. Going into this movie, I was actually looking forward to it quite a bit. I am a fan of the Fast and Furious franchise, and to quickly run down my thoughts on the previous entries, the first three films aren't my favorite things ever, but I did get the appeal of them. The fourth film, I feel, is a transition movie that started to embrace what it destined to be from the beginning, as it was going to more over-the-top action territory than just being street racing movies at first. Then the fifth film happened, and that's when they started to get really good. And I think with that, 6 and 7, those are my three favorites of the franchise. And if I had to pick one, I would say that Furious 7 is my absolute favorite of the entire series. And I felt that is where the series should have ended, especially with the advent of Paul Walker's passing and the movie being completed at that point to not only preserve his memory, but also just to deliver another entertaining entry. And for me, I love that film. That isn't to say that I didn't enjoy what came after that movie. I did enjoy The Fate of the Furious, the 8th entry to the series, though I didn't think it held a candle to the previous 3 entries, but I still thought it was a fun time. Now we have Fast and Furious presents Hobbs and Shaw, which I can't believe the series has gone up to this point in now giving us spin-offs like this one. Though, to be fair, the third film, Tokyo Drift, was a spin-off of sorts as well, though it took place later in the timeline of the franchise. Yeah, for a series that is mainly reliant on being mindless with its action and overall storytelling being thin, it was forward-thinking in one sense and in some ways not. But even so, Hobbs and Shaw did have my attention, with our two leads being two former villains of the franchise, now having to work together while butting heads, and it looked like it was going to veer into more ridiculous territory. Starting out with the cast and their performances, we have one of our two leads, Luke Hobbs, played by Dwayne Johnson. He was the villain of Fast 5, and coincidentally, as I thought the series was getting better with that 5th entry, I think a lot of the reasoning for that is with Dwayne Johnson's introduction into the franchise. And here in Hobbs and Shaw, he backs up a lot of his charisma and his muscle-bound resilience within the action scenes. All of that really shows that Johnson is a genuine star, especially when he is at odds with Deckard Shaw, as played by Jason Statham. Now, he was the villain of Furious 7, and that was made instantly clear with the mid-credit scene of Fast and Furious 6, when he murdered one of the major players of the previous films up until that point. Then he became an ally of sorts in The Fate of the Furious, along with Johnson's Hobbs. But yeah, that's what happened with that film. And here in Hobbs and Shaw, he is still acting as he is with his own sinister and vile nature. But then, as I mentioned, he has to reluctantly work with Hobbs to stop the fate of the world in being at the hands of a deadly virus. And Johnson and Statham, as our title characters, really have some comedic chemistry with one another. They showed off a bit of that with the previous film, Fate of the Furious, but we get a lot more of that here, and a lot of it does come down to into some insulting jokes, which are really dick measuring contests when it comes down to it. But that's what I thought added a lot of the entertainment value to this film. And these two together, I mean, these two are some of the most likable action stars of our current era in movies. So I thought that these two were outstanding. Similarly, I also thought that Vanessa Kirby as Shaw's sister Hattie was very good. She is an MI6 agent who literally has the virus within her. And speaking of her being an MI6 agent, a lot of us saw her previously in last year's Mission Impossible Fallout, where she had a small but pivotal role and showed off a bit of her action movie chops. That is put on much more of a bigger display here in Hobbs and Shaw. And I thought that she was a cool addition to the series, as is Idris Elba as the villain of the film, Brixton Lore. Like Kirby's character, he's another MI6 agent who has gone rogue, but he has gone rogue in more ways than one, as he is a supercharged human, or as he puts it, he's the Black Superman. And he is a deliciously cheesy and really self-aware villain. This guy knows who he is, and he is a clear threat to not just our heroes, but the rest of the movie as a whole. And I thought that as a villain in comparison to the rest of the Fast and Furious franchise, yeah, he's instantly one of the more memorable ones, and he's Idris Elba. Idris Elba is the definition of badass. Other supporting players include the likes of Eiza Gonzalez as an old acquaintance to Deckard Shaw. She shows up about halfway through the film to have a couple minutes of screen time, which I found disappointing because she is plastered all over the marketing for this film, and she's only there to help out our heroes and be a plot device. She seemed cool, but I wish she had more to do. There's also Cliff Curtis as Hobbs' brother, and he doesn't show up until well into the movie. They look nothing alike, but I thought he was a neat addition as well, and it backed up the theme of family, as the entire franchise has so emphasized across all of its entries. And then there's Helen Mirren as Shaw's mother, and she shows up briefly here as well. It's always nice to see her. She was introduced in The Fate of the Furious, and I thought it was too perfect of casting. Overall, I thought that the cast here was pretty solid, especially our two leads, Johnson and Statham, and even Elba and Kirby. The writing of this film, if we have to talk about the writing of a Fast and Furious film, is simple in that it is cheesy, it is ridiculous, it is over the top. This film has now veered into sci-fi territory, given how our villain is this supercharged human. The threat of the world is being put at stake with this deadly virus. All of that makes it very clear that this franchise has really transcended into a league of its own. And when it comes to the story overall, yeah, this movie is more than something that you have to suspend your disbelief for, because it does veer into sci-fi territory, as I said, and also it going into specific actions that really aren't realistic in the slightest, but these are movies after all. They're escapist fare. This goes in the way of the action and how it is directed overall as well. This movie is directed by David Leitch, who is previously known to have helmed some other notable action films. He co-directed the first John Wick film with Chad Stahelski. He directed Atomic Blonde from 2 years ago, and he also directed last year's Deadpool 2. Now, with all of that, I think he has helmed the action to such a skillful degree, and in Hobbs and Shaw, I think that is no different. There are some hand-to-hand combat sequences here that I think are his strong suit, with how they are choreographed and framed. When the movie does go into some more wider shots and showing off the action in that way, the movie does rear its ugly head at times with how the CGI is incorporated, which gets me into more of the technical merits of the film. The rest of the Fast and Furious franchise up until this point, I think, have had some pretty decent CGI, but sometimes it did look inconsistent, and it looked like the characters were either floaty, the backgrounds were a little fuzzy, anything like that. But even so, I thought most of the action was helmed pretty well, and it does go into what one would expect with a movie like this. Nothing more, nothing less. And then with the rest of the technical merits, I think this movie is competently done as well, just like how the rest of the franchise has been able to do up until this point, what with the cinematography, the editing, it not being too erratic, the music, and even the overall pace. This movie is a little lengthy at about 2 hours and 15 minutes, and I don't know if it's because I'm used to sitting through long movies at this point, but I didn't feel like the pace was all over. That's been one of the criticisms with this movie that I have seen, but I didn't think that this movie felt too long. I felt pretty content with it overall in terms of how it flowed, mainly because I guess the action sufficed for all of the stuff that this movie doesn't have in its own shining ways. And that's what I can mainly say about this movie overall. Just like with the last two movies I have seen and reviewed in theaters, the Lion King remake and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, if you know what you're getting into when seeing all of these films, then there shouldn't be that much issue in the long run, as these are movies with specific audiences in mind. And with Hobbs and Shaw, I pretty much got what I wanted when I saw this film and walking out of it, as I expected this movie to be such a ridiculous affair, and it going into specific ventures that I, as a fan, do expect from a franchise like this. It's the kind of film, just like a lot of the other entries, that have you want to sit back, relax, and shove a bunch of popcorn in your face and enjoy what mindless action does ensue. Or in my case, I actually got some nachos and an icy. This is also coming from somebody who rarely gets concessions when watching a movie in theaters as often as I do go, so there is that as well. And what's also there to consider with Hobbs and Shaw is that if you've never seen a film in the Fast and Furious franchise, you could go into this one without much context. All you really need to know is that our title two characters are at odds with each other, and the rest is pretty much accessible to anyone who is uninitiated with the Fast and Furious franchise. As I mentioned, fans of this franchise will be into this film like I was. If you aren't a fan of this franchise, or you know that this movie is not going to give you much in the way of quality or any Oscar-worthy scenes, then this is something you should stay away from in general. This is meant for the fans and fans of any action film that goes into the over-the-top camp. Be sure to stay all the way through the credits, as there are some cameos that are featured here that were set up earlier in the film, and I don't want to give away who's in this movie, so I'll just leave it at that. I recommend Hobbs and Shaw. My final verdict for Fast and Furious Presents Hobbs and Shaw is 3.5 out of 5 stars. Thank you all, as always, for watching. Be sure to like this video, comment on what you thought of Fast and Furious Presents Hobbs and Shaw. Social media links in the description. Subscribe to my channel for more, and I'll catch you on the next movie review.